I go ahead and get started. My name is Camille Nebaker. I am one of the MPIs for the Ethics Core for the Bridge to AI Center. And we've been running a monthly discussion forum to talk about the ethical, legal, and social implications associated with the use of artificial intelligence in health research and healthcare, and talking a lot about just various aspects from the design of a data repository to its use, to testing models, to how data are accessed. And oftentimes, I think when people think about what are the ethical issues, they automatically go to maybe informed consent or enrolling a participant. But there are so many places where we have to make ethical decisions, or situations that require us to think about what are the choices that we have. Because with ethical dilemmas, sometimes there's just not a really great option. And yet we can do a lot by listening to one another, by learning from one another. And the purpose of this discussion forum is to learn more about things that we could do to make our research, our build out of a data repository thoughtful. And how do we think through these ethical, legal, and social implications? So it's my honor, privilege, delight to introduce you to Dr. Shannon McWeeney, who many of you already know. She's a PI on AI Ready, one of the grand challenges for the Bridge to AI program. She is a professor of cancer data science in the Division of Oncological Sciences, chief data officer and associate director of data science at OHSU Knight Cancer Institute. She's also the director of bioinformatics, biomedical informatics at OHSU Knight SMART program. Shannon, I know there's so many more things that I could say about your bio, so please add whatever parts that you'd like to elaborate on. She'll be speaking to us for about 20-25 minutes on the ethical, legal, and social implications in AI quality assurance and model validation, case studies, and evolving approaches. And then we will have a discussion forum. Feel free to keep your video on. This is really intended to be a presentation that sparks conversation. So the more engagement we get, the more opportunities there are for us to talk with each other about some of the issues that Shannon will raise. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. McWeeney, and thank you for being with us.
I'm happy to, and I'm not going to add to my introduction. Thank you. You did more than enough. I prefer the brief introductions, not the massive ones. I'm happy to be here. My email's on here. I have my normal disclosures when I do any talk, but I also want to make a disclaimer. This is a 20-minute overview to kind of generate some ideas and discussion for the remainder of the time. So there's a lot that I'm not going to cover. So please feel free to email me if you're interested in additional references or topics or things that I'm just kind of covering lightly just because of the time constraint. So I think a key question for us to consider is why QA and model validation matters. And I'm, of course, talking to the choir here because many of you are here because you're working in AI or you're part of Bridge to AI. And so you already know this answer, but I think it's important that we're all on the same page, and especially when we're communicating it to others, because this is not one of the things that people get most excited about, and yet it's really critical. So we know that we can improve outcomes with the correct A model for the right task in healthcare, so I'm being cautious, but they need to be accurate, reliable, and safe in real world usage. And so when we think about quality assurance or QA and rigorous model validation, we recognize that those are essential to do many things. One is to build trust, because if we don't have trust, even if the model is incredibly accurate, it will not be utilized in a clinical setting, to protect patients, and obviously to ensure that we are complying with regulations. And there's more than that, but this is what I'm trying to really make the bridge, is that this is a critical component when we want to think about the impact of AI in healthcare. This is the part that we just don't want to skip over when we think about that actual implementation and deployment. So to none of you on here, this will not be, to anyone on here, this is not a surprise, but this is not a one-time event. This really is a continuous process throughout the AI life cycle. We tend to think about terms, and I'll come back to this, like model validation when we're in scenarios like the actual model development, but actually we need to think about it when it's been deployed to a new site. and when it's updated, when there's changes that are made, et cetera. And the QA piece, absolutely, especially when we think about the fact that in a clinical setting, if the model is relying on EHR data, we know that that's very dynamic data that's changing over time. So these are absolutely continuous processes. And so that's one of the things that I do want you to think about, not kind of that traditional idea of we just trying to get the model to production or, to be deployed, but the fact that it'll need to be a continual investment of resources and oversight. So when we think about some of the key components with QA, we're really thinking about both the data and the model, right? So the data quality, the model performance, ethical compliance, both before and after deployment. Validation is actually multi-layered, and many people will tend to think about, especially in a clinical setting, the analytical validation. So does the model perform as intended? And then clinical validation, is it actually improving outcomes when it's put into a real-world clinical setting? Now, you'll also hear things like internal and external validation, and that's often where the focus is, right? We're thinking about developer-led, or we're thinking about independent validation in the model. But when you're thinking about actually bringing it to a new academic medical center or clinical site, then local validation at that site with their data, prospective clinical studies and ongoing monitoring are actually required, and they're actually much more important when we think about the model after it's been generated. That's really what I'm referring to when I'm thinking about validation, or those steps, not the actual model development, because those are the ones that will actually be critical to ensure generalizability and safety at that site. So there's a number of strategies that are implied. Again, this is an overview talk. I've kind of bolded a couple that I just want to mention. One that I think you're all familiar with is human in the loop. This is a very popular form of QA. One of the challenges is that it's very heterogeneous in terms of how much training have we done? What have we done to try and prevent automation bias? You know what I'm saying? What kind of support do we have? The level at which it's implemented. So it is probably one of the top things that people go to or are utilizing currently, but it is still, again, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how it's actually being deployed or utilized. Within data-centric testing, one that you may not be familiar with is data augmentation. And this is where we can utilize adversarial or synthetic data to actually assess rare or edge cases, which is actually very important because often the data that it was tested on, or the majority of the data that it sees are not where the problem may arise. It may be in these rare cases that were actually missed in the model development. Model interpretability and explainability, I'm not even going to touch because that's its own topic, and I think it's actually been covered on here and elsewhere in Bridge to AI multiple times. There is a lot of work now on automating QA and retraining within the pipelines once it's actually been deployed, and also things like assurance wrappers where there's a black box issue, right? So the code is not made available, and so there's things that we want to do both in terms of QA and validation. And so there's been a work on new methods through these wrappers to deal with that. And then with ethic and compliance testing, we see a lot of emphasis and focus on equity or fairness audits. One of the things I'll touch on at the end is that, again, there's a lot of metrics out there. There's a lot of definitions of fairness. Again, you've heard this already in this seminar. But one of the challenges is not having kind of agreement on what are the core consensus metrics, especially if we want to think about how a model is performing, not just at our site, but across sites. Now, there are some work, and this is, again, an overview on standards and tools. I'm highlighting a couple of them. One is the British standard that came out about 2 years ago. This was attempting to be an auditable framework for AI QA, and it had 18 assessment criteria, including human factors and equity. There also is, and this is a very industry-specific maturity model, and it was entirely focused on phases of validation and maturity of validation. We think about maturity of institutions for AI or of models, but this was the model that I'm referring to here was entirely focused on validation. And then we do see as well work on automated validation tools, and I've highlighted some of them that can actually streamline performance tracking, regression testing, and version control. Now, there's one gap that we have, there's many gaps, but one that I want to highlight on this slide is that when it comes to the standards around the documentation, that's where things get a little bit grayer, and also how we're integrating them. So we've had a lot of discussions within Bridge to AI about data sheets for data sets or model cards. There's been a lot of work by the Bridge Center and by other sites. AI Ready, for example, provided our data sheets, documentation And there's actually a paper that Bhavesh Patel from our site has been leading, on that work. And I know that Bridge Center was very active in this area as well. But when we think about the documentation itself and those performance metrics that came from the QA and the validation, especially when we're no longer talking about the scenario of I'm developing the model has now been developed and it's being deployed, and this local validation is happening at these various sites. That's a missing piece that we need to think about in addition to the data sheets and model cards when we really think about transparent and safe and ethical use of AI, right? That piece has been missing, as well as even just the standardization on what the documentation should be. So I want to give one clinical case study. I referred to this in the abstract. This is not from my institution, but this is one that I think is a really great example of a lot of thoughtfulness and also gives an idea of the amount of investment that is needed. So this is a clinical case study that is actually very relevant to almost every academic medical center. We have this issue in which we know that doctors are not data clerks, and there's a tremendous amount of time that is taken up in data documentation, and that there are issues with fatigue and burnout and documentation quality. And there's been a number of, and that's what's on the right, possible solutions. What I want to focus on is the adoption of an ambient AI scribe. And the example that we'll use is from Kaiser Permanente. And just to give you a reminder of focus about how large of a healthcare system this is, you're talking about 12.5 million members in 8 geographic regions. So this is a massive healthcare system. And what they did, which is what we all should do, is they started with a pilot, although their scale is going to be a little bit different potentially than our individual site scale. So in 2023, they had a pilot with an ambient AI scribe with approximately 10,000 physicians and staff. And this has actually been published, so you can actually look at it. And they focused on 3 areas. There's more, but I want to highlight this, especially when we think about ELSI implications. So there was clinician training, and you often think about, okay, how to use the software, but they also really tried to focus on what are the key practices to make sure that the technology is not only effective, but safe. They also spent a tremendous amount of time on the consent process, the training of the consent process, and created a template for documentation of this in the EHR because they needed to consent the patients to the pilot. And then obviously training around human in the loop review, because part of the practice was that they couldn't just trust it, that they were going to have to build into their workflow, reviewing the note and ensuring that it was high quality and that there were no issues. They also spent a lot of time on patient-facing materials. This is not unusual, but I do want to mention that it's something that needs thought in terms of both what you're presenting to them as a handout that they can take home, ideally before the encounter, as well as what script you're training your physicians in terms of how they summarize this so it's consistent and accurate and that they really understand what's happening, and that there is no penalty if they don't want to participate. And then also having visual cues in the clinic. That's something that Kaiser pointed out, KP pointed out, so that they're aware that this could be happening and that they will be asked if they will consent or approve for the ambient AI scribe to be used during their session. And then finally, and this is key, when we think about data documentation, we have a number of quality instruments, and they took one of the major one that we think about when you're thinking about quality documentation from human scribes, et cetera, and they adapted it because they really were trying to think about what are the specific considerations for this type of AI. And so 2 that came to the top were both hallucinations and bias. Was it adding things based on its interpretation of what it was hearing in terms of potential bias about the patients or the scenario? And was it hallucinating and adding things that actually weren't in, when you listen to the recording, actually in the recording? So this rollout was successful, and I probably should have highlighted, sorry, going back. So here you can see in the plot that it actually it did very well in terms of the bias and the hallucinations. It was not the most complete note, but it was actually still of a very high quality. And it was because of this pilot that they decided to move toward a system-wide deployment. And this is actually why I wanted to include this in this talk, because they put front and center having a very proactive, scalable QA approach. And they really, this was incredibly thoughtful, and I think while we could discuss in our discussion some of the limitations of this, there were still a number of things that I think should be replicated. One was a phased deployment model. So as they started to roll this out slowly and starting with, not the specialty clinics, really focusing on kind of, the more high throughput areas, more generalizable, if you will, rather than getting into the specialties. They made sure that they were linking the analysis that they did at each phase with the risk assessment before they proceeded, and actually, and I'll show you this in a minute, taking in feedback to improve the approach. They actually enlisted their clinician users to crowdsource the QA data. They conducted both quantitative and qualitative analyses. That was actually quite important. Things that would be missed or potential biases that could come up. They had a separate safety work stream that was really reviewing the end-to-end workflow at each phase. And they were very concerned about reporting bias. So for example, they noticed that when it came to comments or text, they were really only appearing in the negative rankings. So they had like a star, 5-star rating in terms of how people were, as well as the ability for them to leave qualitative comments. And so this was something that they actually focused on and used other orthogonal measures with to make sure that they were getting an accurate picture for the entire range, especially even when something is ranked well, there could still be issues and you want to capture that to improve it. And then because of this phased approach, they were then able to focus on the smaller clinical specialties and settings. So this, again, this is only QA. So the model evaluation activities were being conducted by the vendor with KP, and it really did provide them a real world assessment across a variety of clinical contexts. And that paper is also available. It's in New England Journal of Medicine AI. So this is just one example of this idea of how user feedback became part of this critical feedback loop and what actions it actually had from a QA perspective for both the user recommendations and the model improvements. So when there were things about omission or oversynthesis, there were both recommendations that they could make to the users, as well as improvements that they would do within the workflow. And then because this was multi-phase, they could then test it and get the data back. So this was an incredibly thorough, again, not perfect, nothing is perfect, but incredibly thorough, very large scale rollout of an ambient AI scribe. And a lot of the thought and consideration, especially the various stakeholder groups that had to be engaged. So when we think about kind of an ELSI lens on or an expanding QA and model validation, I think that one of the things I'd highlight from that rollout was really this focus on the AI specific considerations, because we roll out lots of different software within a clinical environment all the time, but really thinking about things like fairness, about like transparency, safety, and privacy, the clear recognition upfront that it was not just education of their IT or just their physicians, but also the staff and very much the patients. And then really understanding that stakeholder engagement, including the patients and clinicians, was essential in order for this to be a trustworthy validation and monitoring, right? Because it's one thing to put something into a clinical workflow. It's another thing for it actually to be adopted and trusted and utilized by the providers. So I just want to take a moment to kind of talk about, what activities that have been happening nationally. And this is just one of several groups. And so but I want to not pick on it, I want to highlight it because of the shifts that are happening nationally and kind of what the implications were. So there have been discussions for the last several years around assurance labs or national assurance labs. And these would be third-party entities where they could validate the algorithms. And many of the models were kind of a bring your data to this or using OMOP or other standardized data models. All the data would be sitting with the assurance lab. And then the model would be validated there. There were a number of issues that came up from this, especially around privacy, equity, transparency, and also concerns about real world effectiveness and safety, because having standardized data that's sitting centrally is not the same thing as the local validation. So there was a huge push both from in this consortium, which is why they changed, as well as outside, to really consider the emphasis on local validation and also to consider the equity aspect of who would be able to engage with these models, especially when you think about smaller hospitals and clinics, et cetera, that are looking to validate or utilize these models. So they shift now to this idea of certifying these assurance providers. And so that's not just the testing, but now also being able to provide training, monitoring, and governance support for various sites. So this is an evolving topic and one we could pick up or not, but I didn't want to have this without bringing it up because this has been very rapid. The change within, this is CHI I'm referring to here. There are several other consortiums, but the change that CHI did very publicly and very transparently in this model was really because of a lot of this feedback and these discussions that happened. And I would say that they were the ones who are out front thinking about this, which is why we saw the change happen so rapidly. These changes just happened within the last few weeks. So finally, just some thoughts, because I know we want to really keep the time for discussion. When we think about the future of QA and validation in clinical AI, I think that, again, just emphasizing my initial point, really thinking about how to have scalable, and that's the word that's missing here, but rigorous, transparent, and ongoing QA and model validation is the foundation for safe, ethical, and effective clinical AI. There's some things that we need, though. So I gave the example of the fairness metrics, and I know we've had some talks within B2AI, this symposium and others, around fairness and some of the metrics. There are a very large number of them. And so I think especially if we're trying to understand about model performance across sites, especially if a site has limited resources and is trying to really determine if they're going to adopt a model where it would be a much bigger investment for them than and potential resource sink. Then having some standardization or consensus around what metrics are core and are critical nationally would actually be quite helpful. There are also new metrics where we're missing. If you think about the dimensionalities that we've been discussing for AI, and even in the Kaiser example, sometimes the number of metrics or the ways that we think about actually quantifying or measuring this can be quite shallow, or we're still dealing with it because it's in development. So generative AI, they were focused on hallucination. But there are some evolving metrics around generative AI. Obviously, there, depending on the use case, especially when we think about scaling this, that's a consideration. And then multimodal AI. So, when we think about even just things like interpretability or explainability, which also goes hand in hand with trust and safety, depending on the strategy that was used for multimodal AI, the ability to really understand how those features are contributing, and especially implications for monitoring, are very real. And so that's something there, especially I think the low-hanging fruit is imaging and EHR data. We see that right now when we look at things like the software as medical devices that are approved by the AI-enabled software as medical devices that are approved by the FDA. We absolutely see that. So it's not, a future thing way far off. Multimodal AI is basically here, and we need to be thinking about how to prepare for that in terms of the ways that we can feel comfortable, and not just us, but more importantly, the physicians, the sponsors, or the decision makers in terms of if it's even going to be implemented, the patients around that. There also needs to be support for AI governance. So AI governance is also somewhat heterogeneous. Most academic medical centers at this point now have some form of it, but if it's covering all missions, the extent to which it's engaged in pilots and evaluation or model certification, that still varies tremendously across site. And so there's a real opportunity there for support for academic medical centers around model certification, around this kind of validation process in QA. And then the adoption of standards, automation, and stakeholder engagement are really critical if we're thinking about trying to future-proof this. So that was a pretty fast overview, because I know that the emphasis is on our discussion. And so I'm going to turn off the sharing if I can, so that we can talk a bit based on that.
Thank you so much, Shannon. That was really well done for 20 minutes. Honestly, that was. So I have a question that's come up, and I think, you mentioned KP being, extremely large. They know how to do research. They know how to do incremental steps to do something that's going to be in the best interest of their patient population. And knowing how to do this is so important, and who should be involved. And then I think of UC San Diego, where we do something similar. We take these steps. What about like a small clinic and there's a model that's being pitched. It could be being pitched by whoever is, maybe it's an Epic thing. And maybe they're saying, we have this shiny object. It's going to record all of your conversations with your patient. It's going to accurately transcribe, and it's going to populate your clinic notes. So this is usually pitched to people in procurement.
Yeah.
People
Or,
who are
or
buying.
executive C-level, right?
Yeah, and they don't know what questions to ask. They don't know who should be involved. Might there be a tendency to trust that this has been vetted, that it's been tested, that everybody's on the same page? I'm just thinking about the well-resourced medical centers versus those that aren't well-resourced, and what kind of challenges in terms of validation might be happening because people don't know what they don't know.
So I think that goes exactly to the heart of a point I had at the end of the talk around the equity aspect, because, and I'm thinking about this in terms of accessibility for the various sites, right? As you've already pointed out. So if a hospital does have not just resources, but also limitations on resources, but also limitations on expertise, right? Then it's exactly the issue that you bring up. And that's why we really do need this sharing. And that, I'm saying, so when you think about things like the QA lab, and this is actually at the heart of one of the things that Chai was doing, was having these originally, having these model cards that would also include indications about how they had done in terms of the QA or model validation. That is absolutely front and center, that we want to be able to share that. But again, as I mentioned, so that we don't just have this kind of mess of things, we do need to have some consensus on what is core, right? So that we can think about what are the critical metrics that everyone who is, however we're doing this, right, is doing these processes, is actually looking at. That is, there's clear guidelines around on interpretation, and that's made accessible to other sites, right? So that's a key aspect, and I think we're seeing that over and over come up. I would also say, though, that sometimes size, money, and resources, don't matter. If you have the right person who's really excited, they could sign off on something. And we've seen this. There was a trust, the sepsis model with Epic is a great example of where there was trust of the vendor. And I think that actually was one of the original things that truly highlighted how critical local validation was. So, and I'm not, by the way, there's no negative connotation for any vendor or partner here. It's just that there's kind of these core principles that every site needs to understand. And there's also priorities. So if this is something, now here's the other aspect, Camille, that you touched on that I do want to bring up. Adoption is only the first step, and it's actually the cheapest in the long run. Because as I mentioned in that one slide, there's this ongoing life cycle, and even though it was on the right-hand side, that monitoring, the continuous improvement, the QA, the validation as it's updating, that has to all happen. That's a massive investment in infrastructure. So often what happens when they're being pitched something is they're not being told of all of the costs that come in that they have to have. So if they don't have that infrastructure in place, they don't have what we call ML DevOps. So, and if they haven't, and ideally you'd like to think that at this stage, most settings have been doing something with predictive analytics, predictive models, where they've had some level of this. But depending on the sophistication of the model and how freestanding it is versus integrated and what tools are provided with it, they may have to have a lot of resources there. So that's another place in which they can kind of get caught off guard and think that, okay, this is the resources we need, when actually, plus there's the resources for the pilot. And this is very important when it comes to industry collaboration. So besides even just buying it, they'll come and say, we want to partner with you, and it's FDA approved. And that sounds amazing, except that the FDA is, we've seen from the FDA, and that's why they're now thinking about, post-approval monitoring, is that there's still drift, right? That the performance when it was approved varies tremendously versus the performance when they're deployed. So all of those factors kind of come in to play. And so I think people being, again, this is where you can really rely, or hopefully can rely on your AI governance committee for oversight and for support, is that there's got to be a recognition. There are going to be resources needed at every stage, even the pilot. You can see from what I highlighted with KP, that was a massive pilot. And I don't even just mean the number of people. I mean, the amount of work that went into that pilot. It was a very expensive pilot to ensure that they had the right data to make a decision. And that may not be the case every time, obviously, but there still is a cost for even just doing the local validation to determine that you want to move ahead with the purchase. Then there's the purchase, then there's the actual infrastructure for monitoring and deployment. So it's a great point.
Thank you. I just think we really need to work closely with people in procurement who don't know always what they need to be knowing at this point. Sarah?
Yeah, I agree. Shannon, thanks so much. It's great to hear from you on this because I know you know this so well. I guess I'm wondering just at a really practical level, we're sort of bridge to AI, but specifically AI ready. We've been building this data set, trying to make it as available as we possibly can. And people have been writing in and requesting the data, even from, the pilot data. And now as it's getting to be a bigger data set, lots of people writing in, they want to use it for all kinds of different purposes. How does what you're talking about get applied with those individual requests? Like, do we hope that their individual institutions have this kind of governance mechanism, or do we ask them to sign that they're gonna comply with some of these things, or how?
So I'm gonna say that we have a variety of users. So we have
You,
who are
but
doing I'm augmenting what you're saying, but
yeah.
just for the rest who aren't part of our project. So we have requests that come in that are people who want to develop a model, and that kind of goes back to that first when I was talking about validation, the idea of internal validation and then external. So they might be using our data either for initial model development or more likely for external validation, right? Because it's now giving them a very large cohort of data, not from their site with this with this data. We have people who are coming in terms of education and training, and then we have industry who are coming and thinking very much about it, probably in terms of model development, validation, et cetera. The things that you're describing are some of the guardrails that we have, like the health AI license, the data access committee, depending on the variables or the type of request, the authentication, the attestations. We do all of these things, right, to try and ensure that they will use the data correctly and that they understand the limitations around it. That is just the data. That doesn't say anything, and we all struggle with this. Bridge to AI is agnostic, and that's both a wonderful thing and it's a caution, because the thing that someone still has to be able to say is this the right data for my predictive task? So if I'm using it to validate, if I'm thinking about it in terms of model development, et cetera, the way that our data sets were created, in which there's a tremendous amount of documentation and thoughtfulness around the MOPS and the SOPs, et cetera, to really make sure that it's standardized, it still may not be the right data set for the task at hand. So I think there's also that consideration of, is this the right data set for what I'm trying to do? And then the recognition that none of this will remove the local validation piece, right? Which is that when someone actually says, now I wanted to, so someone else, the model's developed, let's say they used our data, someone else wants to utilize it, they're still going to need to do that local validation at their site. Because our data, while it comes from 3 different healthcares, it's a great example of actually what I was bringing up in terms of all of the clinical data, for example, has been standardized to OMOP, right? And that is fantastic in terms of ensuring interoperability and ensuring consistency. However, that's very different than what a model might see if it was actually deployed within the EHR, right, or within a clinical system. So that standardization step, that kind of centralization of data, while it's an incredibly valuable data set, and this is the other thing, most sites cannot generate the type of data that our grand challenges are generating. So it's incredibly valuable. And because it's agnostic, it can serve a lot of needs, but it still doesn't take the place of that. So when we think about what I'm talking about, especially since I'm starting with this idea that the model's been developed, it could potentially serve if there was a reason why they wanted to provide data for initial metrics from a vendor, let's say, without giving their data. It still could have a use, but ultimately it's not going to replace the local validation step. And that's not a bad thing at all. We weren't designed to do that. But it does, so we do have a critical role and we do have safeguards around the data, but there's still that distinction. And again, the part I don't want to lose, there also has to be that safety check mentally of, is this the right data for this task? And is this also the kind of data that that we're going to see within our site? And that's why the local validation is so critical.
Thank you.
Sarah, I come into this from a very practical and applied thought as well. And I think about the supply chain paper that we have under review right now and how building a repository is not just this front end thing, but you have all of these different areas of expertise that are needed across the entire repository build out, and all of that is pre-model. So when it gets to, the people asking for the data to build the model, we have them attest that they have had certain types of training, that they sign the license, that they won't do stigmatizing research, that they won't try to re-identify people. But it makes me wonder, I think in your response, Shannon, should we be saying, because we can't guarantee that they've been exposed to data science ethics in their formal training, unlike clinicians who do have formal, ethics and clinical care training. It just makes me wonder if there shouldn't be something that we say to people who are getting access to the data: before you do this with your model, these are some steps to take. Do people know that, or would that be a service?
Well, I mean, I'm going to meet you in a different place. I think that there's a lot of work around just responsible use of data, data governance, data stewardship. I think there's a lot of work around that. Doesn't mean that there's not room for more, but I think especially in the non-clinical, in the research realm, there's been a lot, especially for human subjects data, there's been a real push around that. I think that there is the idea, though, of what the model is intended for, right? So where I think there's a gap is between research and the idea of the trajectory for actual potential clinical deployment. And we train a lot of outstanding machine learning, computer scientists, data scientists, computational biologists, and we don't really talk about that. So they develop fantastic algorithms and models that are for research use only. And there is actually absolutely a place for that. But I think there's actually a hunger to be able to have a greater impact. And so if that's the case, then there's other considerations that have to come into play. This actually mirrors what we think about in terms of technology development as well. There are people who do outstanding, amazing work in technology development because they're not thinking about the clinical parameters and timing. Those assays will never make it, at least in their current form, into the clinic, right? There's just a complete mismatch between the realities of especially if you think about something like in oncology, the clinical tumor board in that time frame, and when we need to have a result, or the interpretability of it. So that's a place where I think there's a huge gap, is if they are thinking about those types of models, that we really start thinking about the types of training around things like QA, around things like validation, around these types of metrics that they should be looking at during model development. So what often can happen is if it's done in a research context only, and then the paper or the model has legs, meaning there's a paper, the developers aren't going to do anything more with it, and people realize, wow, this is a great model and it's open source. Then you're kind of backtracking because there was a lot of work that wasn't done in the model development and deployment that actually could have really been informative. And so it ends up getting repeated, et cetera. So I think and most people actually that I've talked with want to have an impact. So I think if there was that training around the additional things, and this is where the documentation also comes in, the model cards, the understanding the data that they used, right? We've talked about this, the bias is in the data. That's why I said, again, even with AI ready, is this the right data for your task? Right. And we've done an incredible amount of work, especially the data teams, on thinking about balance and thinking about this being representative, et cetera. But there's still the question of, for the group that you're thinking about, for your population, for your site, is this the right data? So I agree with you that there needs to be more, but I think I'm a little shifted in terms of where I think it is, because there's a lot of great modeling that happens where the end result is the paper, and then they kind of move on to the next question. Does that make sense?
Could I ask one follow-up question? Camille, you should go first, though, if you.
No, you go ahead,
I
Sarah.
was curious, so much of this feels like, maybe the question is just like, what is the role of the journals and journal reviewers at this? Like, it feels like we're moving in the direction of, some kind of standardized checklist of, did they do all of these things in the preparation of this paper?
There are, and I don't have it in this talk, but there are absolutely guidelines for AI reporting models. And they're actually much more serious when we're thinking about potential clinical models. I want to make one caution, though. We never want to dampen innovation and discovery. And there is absolutely a place for computational modeling and algorithm development that is just focused on discovery. In fact, that's one of the things we try to balance in our AI governance committee here at OHSU, is that balance between safety and compliance and innovation, because we cover all missions, research, education, and the clinic. So I do think that if someone has a paper that is in a research context and they're very excited about it and they want to report it, obviously there's a standard, but there's going to be a different standard if it's now in, let's say, New England Journal of Medicine or New England Journal of Medicine AI, and they're thinking about this for clinical use, right? So I do want to make that gradation, but there absolutely are reporting guidelines around the models. I will tell you that because there's great papers on this, the papers show that they're again, heterogeneity is the theme, right? The use of them completely or the use of them at all, right, varies tremendously. And I think for a journal to decide what they're going to require, and some journals do have guidance on this because of their focus area, will really, again, depend on the context. Because I can tell you, as someone who's been part of both truly clinical papers, where we're really looking at deployment in the clinic versus research, that in the research context, when they tell us, well, what about this for the clinic? We're like, this is the discovery part. And so you don't want to stifle that paper. And especially if we made it very clear that our intent is not that. So I do just, again, want to emphasize a balance, but there are some, they're not perfect, and their usage, unfortunately, is mixed.
Yeah, it feels really analogous, for example, to like the quality improvement efforts around validation of metrics. There are some used for research purposes and they have less validation than the ones that you're hoping to like roll out nationally for comparative purposes, and certainly the ones that have dollar amounts associated with them, a lot more rigor in it, and just sort of knowing where it's super helpful to know kind of where you are in terms of that validation. So that's why I asked about the journals, so that people could kind of report on how much rigor went into it. It would be just to make it easier to understand where the information is coming from and how it was used.
We do want to try and make sure that it is part of the model life cycle in terms of development, though, because especially with the constriction on research funding and the pressures on academic medical centers where a lot of the translational models are developed, not thinking about the big industry ones, I'm talking about, internally. I think that the easier that we can make this, the better, right? So that if it's actually a toolkit that is part of when they're actually developing the model or when they're doing the validation in terms of these metrics, that's really the way to go. If we're really hoping to be able to generalize this and to be able to have this be something that can be shared widely. When we put all the pressure on everyone individually, and that's often what happens sometimes with the journal requirements, is you need to do this and they find out at the end. So again, there's education. There's so many pieces to this. I'm in agreement with you completely. I'm just cautious because there's so many nuances to this. And I often sometimes see the reaction from a journal to be, we're just going to do this path. And it's very important. I'm not making an excuse for anything. This is incredibly critical. We've already, right? That's the theme of my talk, of how critical this is. But we also have to recognize the constraints that the institutions are under, and also how much we have to work together given that, right? And that goes back to Camille's comment just on even the smaller centers or the centers that have more resources or restrictions.
Gary, thank you.
Other questions? So I'm going to take advantage of the pause. We keep getting requests from the NIH to develop tools, maybe could be the word, or guidelines. They would like us to share things that are being labeled a best practice. And we keep resisting calling something a best practice because it's really difficult to say that anything we do has been tested to the point where we could say this is the best practice. But we can have emerging lessons that we could share with people. And from your perspective in this talk about validation and data fit, what would be a good way of sharing that? And that was related to my other question, like, is there a point that before the data go to whoever's requested it, we give them some things that might be intuitive, they might be assumed, but we just state it because we know this will help them not trip up? So is there something like that we could do from things that we've been learning in the program that could not be perfect, but could be a thing that helps.
Right. Well, I mean, and as you know, because you were really active in this, there's been some, well, actually a lot of work, especially given the training and education and outreach pieces for all of our challenges, but and the Bridge Center. There's been work on trying to highlight, you know, especially because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, existing materials, existing trainings that could be leveraged. I think that I want to touch on the comment of best practices. I agree with you completely, but I think there's a term I used in the slides, I'm pretty sure I replicated it, which came from KP, which is key practices. And it was absolutely essential because it needed to be more than just here's something to consider. And that's where I think kind of the education piece is. And it couldn't be a best practice because obviously they haven't system-wide implemented ambient AI before, right? You know what I'm saying? So they're learning from this, but it was these key considerations as part of their training of things that they needed to consider. And again, really keeping in mind both the effectiveness of the software, but also the safety, right? Given the AI consideration. So I absolutely think that there's a place for that, but I would argue it's a little bit closer to what best practices look like and a little less like just the general. And I'm not saying that's what you were implying, Camille. I'm just mentioning because there's been so much work from the DGPs on education and training and in the Bridge Center. So I don't want to diminish that at all. But I do think that and obviously it'll have all the disclaimers because everything is temporal. And as you pointed out, these are emerging. These are not the best practices. But I think having this idea of these key practices or these guidances is incredibly important, especially if they are paired with something that is actionable, like, for example, these toolkits or the metrics, or so that they know what to do. Because it's one thing to say you need to consider equity and fairness in your model, and then they start reading the literature and they get overwhelmed, or they watch a short course and still get overwhelmed. Like, you know what I'm saying? I think we've all seen the table of the 20, 30 different definitions of fairness, right? So it's another thing to say, here are some of the key toolkits and metrics that are, you know, and these are the metrics in particular that actually could be the most informative for this type of task. And here are the metrics that, because remember, the metrics are going to change. If I'm doing a retrieval task versus if I'm doing a predictive task, et cetera, the metrics are actually very different. So that type of annotation, that type of curation, maybe that type of even consensus, you know, consortium-wide consensus is incredibly valuable. And I do think it's something you're going to see that will come out of primed AI, right? So everyone's seen the notices for that. And hopefully you got a chance to attend the strategic planning workshop. I participated in that. But I think that's a place where we absolutely will have to see some of this consensus, but now that of course is focused on the models, we're focused on the data, but we know that they go hand in hand. And so I do think that there is absolutely a place for, again, emerging or key practices, but something that's actionable, something that's tangible, that I think could have an immediate impact.
I agree. And I'm thinking now, when you talked about all the different educational resources, AI Ready's done work in this area. We've got the Bridge to AI Center that has a lot of lectures that have been curated by the folks at UCLA. We've got these discussion forums. I'm trying to think about, like, Moni has been doing a consortium educational thing on a different day of the month. We have a lot. And I now am wondering to myself, are they curated? Have they been organized and labeled? And, you know, and I think this is just part of organizational structure. We do these things, we do them with good intention, and then they sit on a shelf somewhere, and we hope somebody will show up and use them someday. But I think we could probably take a next step pretty soon and do some curation and labeling and make those more visible. And they're not going to be perfect, but they could be a good starting point.
I agree.
You jumped up.
Can I just respond to it really quick? I'm sorry. I agree. I just add one thing though, beyond the curation, beyond the metadata, absolutely, right? So they're discoverable. Actually, I think they might, and this might be with a comment that's coming, I think they actually might already meet FAIR guidelines around that. But I do want to push for the metrics, right? And there was the work, which again, I think might get brought up around what does it mean to be AI ready, right? You know what I'm saying? These dimensions and actually trying to quantify that. But I think for any one of these topics, even if we just take the topics within the QA piece, moving beyond just even here's the lecture or here's the dimension you need to think about, but to have some idea of, because it is so overwhelming for people who have not been working in this, of just even a place to start, right? And how to interpret it, and that this is what it's going to give you. That type of thing would be gold. Because if we really want to change behavior, again, especially given all the resource constraints and the stress, we have to be it so that they can actually integrate it when they're developing the model or when they're doing the validation. So I totally agree with you, but I just want to push a little bit more, because the education alone is not enough. And I'm not diminishing it at all. It's actually critical. It's the foundation, it's the knowledge foundation, but it's especially now, giving them that extra support is so key.
Mhm.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a very, very insightful comment. Thank you for sharing that, because we have looked into, here's the dimension of that we're exploring, and here's the process that we have defined to measure these particular metrics of AI readiness. I really like what you were sharing about, here's what it looks like when you measure it on this particular space. And so I think for, in some introductory way, perhaps having you and all the grand challenges have done a self-assessment with that rubric and those processes kind of like serves as an example. But that doesn't mean we couldn't perhaps create a very handheld, very detailed example of how to run through that particular rubric. Thank you for sharing that. And with other colleagues in the teaming working group from the Evaluation Center at Colorado, as well as colleagues from the Data Sharing Dissemination, we and with Julia Levites, we have been working now on defining a few other metrics of the impact of not just the tooling, but the data sets and the processes. And I really like the perspectives that you have shared today, Shannon, because those are things that we can integrate as we make those the results of all of that evaluation public.
Awesome.
Thank you, Moni. Well, I don't see any other hands. Any other questions? I see a message from Daniela. First of all, Shannon, thank you so much. This was really so helpful. I think even for me, that I've been around and doing stuff in this field for a long time, but I still have more questions than answers. So it was really, I really appreciate you putting this into a concise and just a well done overview of what we need to be thinking about. So thank you for joining us.
Happy to do it. Wonderful.
Always good to see you. We have another talk coming up on July 15th. It's at noon Pacific time, 3 o'clock Eastern time. Dr. Gassemi will be presenting the pulse of ethical machine learning in health. And again, we do this every month. They're all recorded. I put the link to the recordings in the chat, so you're all welcome to go back and look and see what we've been talking about. Until next month, have a good rest of July, and we'll see you good rest of June, and we'll see you in July. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon. This was great.
Thank you. And great comment about, she mentioned checklist as another way to think about it, which is a really great idea, Camille, just in terms of that conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks, Shannon.